My only role, I hope, will be to introduce Carson Block and Rob Jackson. We had planned to do this in person, but Carson was unable to make it in person, and so he is available by video, I hope. So we can go ahead and show Carson. Hi, Carson.
Hey.
So Carson Block is the founder of Muddy Waters Research, has been a friend of this conference, has been a supporter, and has been our go-to for participating in the great debate. And so thank you, Carson, for being here. Rob Jackson is a professor at NYU Law School, former SEC commissioner, and I think really uniquely blazed the trail for merging careful academic study with policy work as a commissioner at the SEC, and wrote speeches that were essentially law review articles, and is not only astute but a true public force, I think, on substantive issues. And I'm a great admirer of both of your brains, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time. My preparation, just so you can see it, I have Carson and Rob. I have one column for each of them, and they had, in agreeing to ground rules, they had agreed just to go at it. And so hopefully I'll be off video and you two can just go at it. But Carson, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks, Frank. Yeah, I got to say, I get why Josh wouldn't go head to head with me after watching that. You know, I had prepared remarks, but those are out the window. Seemed like a pretty typical management response call where there's more misdirection and an attempt to misdirect or an attempt to focus on anything but the issues. So I'm just going to lay into it right here. Number one, he wrote a paper in 2018 titled Short and Distort. He submitted a rulemaking petition to the SEC in 2020 titled Rulemaking Petition for Short and Distort, citing his research, which claimed that among the sample of 1,720 short attacks, manipulation was widespread. Now, here's the thing. In his own data set, only 20.9% of the authors disclosed being short. In his own data set, 55% say not short. And then there's this blank for the rest of it. But basically, he did not study short sellers, and he came to these conclusions. So it's important to understand what Seeking Alpha is. Seeking Alpha is like a big investment club, basically. You have people on there who are in high school writing stuff, college writing stuff. You have people who are just trying their hands. Now, when you look at this notion that there were 1,720 articles written by pseudonymous short activists on companies with market caps of 2 billion plus in an 8-year period that ended in 2017, that prima facie to somebody who's in the industry was greatly surprising, because the reality is there are very few short activists who can swing a bat in that mid-cap space. And, you know, my team and I are among the relatively few. So the idea that there were this many written during that period of time was just, it was always puzzling. But despite the claims of transparency, Josh did not release that data until 2020. So when he and I took the stage in 2019, I did not have the benefit of looking through the 123 columns and 9,000 plus rows of his Excel sheet to see that such a small percentage were actually short. So what really I take issue with in this response here, I mean, he's making shit up that, well, they're being paid by hedge funds. Where's the evidence? Okay, the vast majority of those pieces are likely just people trying their hand at saying something about stocks. Now, when we looked at the data, and this is certainly, you know, Josh went further in finance than I did. I only have a BS in finance. He has a PhD. But when you look at the data, there are really two groups that stand out right away. One, the group that says they are short, the 20.9%, and then two, a group that authored articles that fall within 10 calendar days of earnings announcements. And then there's this leftover group that's noise. Now, Josh talks about these V patterns. And so if you see a V, it's manipulation. And so first he shows non-pseudonymous short activists. Says, oh, see, no V, it goes down and stays down. But here, look at my pseudonymous shorts, and there's this V. Well, here's the thing. If you look at the 20.9% that are saying they're short, they actually outperform the non-pseudonymous shorts. That goes down and stays down. So then is everybody else taking money from hedge funds and just, not disclosing that? Which, by the way, in Seeking Alpha, that is part of the disclosure, receiving compensation or not. The answer is no, because if you then isolate just the articles published within 10 days of an earnings announcement, the entire V effect comes from there. So group one, disclosed actual short sellers. There's no V, no manipulation per his definition. Group two, not short and not within 10 days of an earnings announcement. No statistically significant movement. That is flat. Only group three within 10 days of an earnings announcement has a V. Now, he goes on to look at the options trading. And he says, oh, you see all these at-the-money put options being bought just before the publication. Well, so if you know anything about how markets work, a lot of long holders will hedge their long positions going into earnings. So once again, if we separate these three groups to look at them, what do we see? Well, we see no abnormal put buying activity of at-the-money put options by the actual is short group. We see nothing of the sort in the noise group, but we see it in the earnings announcement group. So that is where the elevated put buying activity comes from. But more to the point is that elevated put buying relative to before publication is actually lower than the average post publication. So it's as though he somehow forgot to look forward a little bit in telling you that this was elevated put buying. But I go back to this precept. This is the fundamental point. In his own data, only 20.9% were short. And based on that, which again, he was not transparent about that when that report first came out, in January of 2019, I saw an article in the Globe and Mail that stated he was going and meeting with regulators in the US and Canada to discuss his short and distort findings. So he's lobbying regulators in early 2019 without being transparent about this. Finally, as for the conflicts, look, when he published that in June of 2018, actually, let me go back to that 2 billion point because that's important. That V only exists, as Frank pointed out, when you get to 2 billion on up. Now, that is, especially when you know activist short selling, that is a very arbitrary mark. But the reason that you see a V finally at 2 billion is because that's where people are playing earnings. That's where you get more institutional ownership of stocks. That's where you get people who are going to hedge it. Below 2 billion, a lot of it's trading on narrative, it's micro cap stuff. But if that 2 billion, if that wasn't the cutoff, there would be no V. So what are the odds? I really wonder, what are the odds that Josh actually went into this project before reviewing the data saying, you know what, 2 billion is the level at which I'll establish this. And that happens to be the exact level at which the V is present. Based on the fact that he did not disclose that only 20.9 were short, and he accuses everybody of manipulation, which, Frank, Rob, please tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe that to manipulate a stock, you need to have an economic interest in it. So this is basically what you just saw was a typical management response to being busted, where they're going to throw a lot of buzzwords out, talk about the non-issues, and avoid facing the music here. So with that, that's my opening salvo. Over to you guys.
Carson, it's good to see you. Can you see me, man? Can you see me, Carson?
It's good to see you. Yeah, I can see you. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, man. So, hi, everybody. It's a hard act to follow, but I'll try. So, let me start with 3 things that I know are true. First of all, Carson Block has uncovered more fraud and saved investors more money than me or anyone else who's had the job I had as an SEC commissioner, and then most other market participants. And if you're at an event called Fraud Fest, he is and should be one of your heroes, because he goes into the market and takes risky positions and reveals fraud for investors. And he does that at a rate and in a way that is as effective or more effective as SEC lawyers and as plaintiff lawyers. And I think that's to be admired. And you just saw why, by the way. Because who in the hell would want to be on the other side of the phone with this guy? So first, there's no doubt that Carson is an incredibly sophisticated, very thoughtful market participant who he's been supportive of this event because he is, in my view, the illustration of the kinds of market forces that protect investors when management gets things wrong and when they commit fraud. That's first. Second, and I say this with all the affection and respect that everything I just said demands, Carson is not offering what could be described fairly, I think, as an academic critique of an academic paper. Instead, what's happening here, just to be perfectly fair, it's been publicly reported that Carson received a search warrant in connection with certain allegations of the government related to so-called short and distort campaigns. Now, I have no knowledge whatsoever and don't want any, because I don't want to be deposed. I don't want any knowledge about what the background facts are there. But I will say this, if I were in receipt of a search warrant that I thought had anything at all to do with an academic paper, I'd sound like that about the academic paper. And I want to say just one institutional point about that as a law professor. I don't do the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. I leave that for I do corporate law. I leave the Constitution for the smart folks. But for me, the Fourth Amendment makes clear the circumstances under which a search warrant can issue. And it lists the things that are necessary: findings of probable cause, oaths sworn accordingly. It doesn't say anything about law papers, law professor papers. It doesn't say anything about the Journal of Legal Studies. So I don't think that Carson has the right target in the attack that he's leveling. I think his beef, and it sounds like he has one, might be with the people at the Department of Justice or the magistrate or judge who signed off on the search warrant. And I'm happy to have that conversation to the degree that I know anything about it. But I don't think his beef is with Josh Mitz, who wrote a paper in the Journal of Legal Studies related to a market dynamic he noticed. Third point, the critiques that Carson levels are actually deeply important in two ways. First, the technical critiques, you've heard a few. I'll offer some thoughts about them quickly. They matter, I think. I'll just give one example where I think because of his own interest in the subject matter, Carson is overstating. While it's true that if you choose by firm size, some of the results change, if you, as Frank pointed out in his interview with Josh, if you have no size constraints on the sample, you see the results that Josh gets. So what Carson has basically shown is if Josh makes an arbitrary choice, you see the results. If Carson makes an arbitrary choice, you don't see the results. If no one makes any arbitrary choices, you see the results. That doesn't strike me as a fatal flaw connection with the paper. Instead, it strikes me as an observation about the nature of the data set. But Carson just described it to you as some kind of giant hole in the analysis. And I can tell you I do this for a living. It's not. And
can you clarify that for a second? So it sounded like you were saying if there was no limitation, there is a V. Is that what you said?
If there's no size constraint, that's right, Carson. That's absolutely right. If there's no size constraint, you get the same result in this data set. Now, what I'll say about that is that
there's no V with no size constraint. There's none until you get to 2 billion.
You're wrong. You're wrong. What you said, it's not what your paper says. What your paper says is if you limit the firms to a certain size, you get that result. I'm saying if you have no constraints, if you just treat the whole data set, and I've run the regression, you get the result. But look, I want to put that to one side, because what's more important to me is not whether there's a technical problem with the paper, but the question Carson is asking, which is a good and a hard one. Because you heard what he said. To me, among what Carson said, by far the most persuasive thing is that Josh Mitz is an academic, but he's engaged in the market stuff that he's studying. Yeah, like he's asking regulators questions, and he's walking into offices, and he's representing companies in connection with short campaigns, and Carson's got good questions about that. And I think the shame of it is that because, with all respect, Carson, the way you went about the paper, you publicly and repeatedly accused Josh of being an academic fraud. You did that while his tenure case was in pendency, and because of that, I think we didn't get at what actually the interesting questions that we should talk about, which are, when academics get involved in market activities, what should that look like? So for example, Josh writes this paper, he finds this outcome. Should he not consult with, for example, the government or with private entities about what he's written and said? I'll tell you, that rule has some appeal to me, but if that's the rule, I broke it. Because I wrote lots of papers about insider trading and then went on to the SEC to be a commissioner. And I don't mind telling you that many defendants came into the room with me and said, you can't be objective about this because you've already written a paper in the area. And you obviously think insider trading is bad. And I said, you're right. And I'm still going to vote against your case. And if you want to take me to the Supreme Court, good luck. So for me, I think we should have a conversation about what are the rules of the game when academics like us see something in the market that we think is interesting, and we want to be involved with those market participants. And I'll tell you why it's really important to get advice from someone like Carson about this. It's really interesting to me, Carson, that when you look at Josh's conversation with Frank, what you see is a management call. Unlike you, I haven't been on dozens of management calls. I can't look a guy in the eye and see where he's confident and where he's not and detect fraud the way you do, because I haven't had the astonishing career that you've had. And I think we should talk about what we want out of academics who are going to get involved in boardrooms and with market participants. And I think that's really important because every academic you'll talk to will tell you that academic integrity is really important, but they do a fair bit of consulting on the side. Present company included. So let's have an honest conversation about what actually the role is that you want for academics to be involved in market with market participants.
Look, I'm not here to change the academic world. Okay, I'm here to discuss one paper by one professor. So, and most of what you said doesn't touch on the central fact here that basically is the basis for my stating that he committed academic fraud. So effectively, what he did was to publish a paper that said, I've studied 1,720 dogs and I found that they like to use the litter box. But then when you actually get to the data a couple years after publishing it, you see that only 20% of them were dogs and the rest were actually cats. Okay, that is what he has done. Now, whether academics should engage with regulators, whether they should consult, whatever, these are not the questions that interest me. And I'm not an expert on what the policies should be. But I can tell you that, yes.
Sorry, Carson, I'm puzzled. Let me stop you there. I'm puzzled because at the end of your remarks, you said, this is a guy who's lobbying the regulators. He wrote a petition. He's consulting with, is that a problem or is it not, Carson? Help me understand.
Oh, it's a problem when you fraudulently misrepresented your data to then go before the regulators and pitch.
It's only a problem when you're wrong.
And I guess well, if you're fraudulently misrepresenting, I think by definition you're wrong. But one of the interesting things that we didn't get into, but I think is actually really it kind of tickles me about this case. Having been a lawyer, I know that most lawyers are intimidated by even relatively basic forms of math. And when you open his paper, there are all these integral equations and X, Y. You know that the people who peer reviewed this, you know that the SEC and DOJ lawyers who looked at this have no idea what the fuck any of this means. And they're like, whoa, man, that's, that looks like he's done some real work. And that's the thing. If you tried to get that by a finance guy, I really don't think he would have gotten that far. In fact, that's what several finance academics have said to me. And if you go back to the whole thing of, where was he in 2018? What was he thinking? So the vast majority, to my recollection, I think every academic attempt to study short activism has largely shown that it adds value, that short activists are perceived as having been correct. And if you just get out there and you second that, or, in this case, like 100th it, who are you? Like, nobody's going to care, right? Just take a number, stand in line. He was pretty much alone in claiming that there's a problem with short activism. And, if we're going to ask ourselves
a few things about that. Sorry. The conference is called Fraud Fest, so we should be accurate. Like that there's a lot that's just wrong, Carson. I think you know that it's wrong. So first of all, you know that a lot of the people who peer review the Journal of Legal Studies have formal training in finance and economics. You know that Josh Smith, quite apart from this paper, has published in the Journal of Finance which is the top-ranked journal on finance in the field. And the paper that he wrote was awarded one of the best 3 empirical papers in finance that year. You know that it's true, of course, that the guy
Does anybody
didn't...
read the Excel?
Listen, Carson, I understand that...
That's stunning.
Let me ask you, Carson, if I came to you and said, hey, listen, man, I have a paper that I'm not so sure about. Here are my objections. In unrelated news, I've received a search warrant from the FBI having to do with the subject studied in this paper. But trust me, I know what's going on in the paper. You wouldn't react a little skeptically of that, having built a career around calling people on their bullshit?
I guess the good news for me is that I was on this stage in 2019 calling bullshit on his paper just without the underlying data, knowing there was something wrong about that paper, knowing that there was a lot wrong about it, but without the data. So it's not an FBI search warrant that did this. This is actually, like, I've been very consistent. And the entire, everybody I've talked to in activist short selling in academia who studied it has been skeptical of this guy's work from day one. Now, somehow or another, I was the first one to actually download the data and go into it. And, I was expecting this to be a little bit hard, but as soon as I saw, wow, only a small minority of the authors are actually short. He did not study short sellers. When you say short and distort, I think there's a strong implication that somebody has shorted the stock before publishing it. I don't know, man. I could have 10 FBI search warrants, but that does not change the fact that in his data set, he knew that only a small minority were actually short the stock. And you go and you write about short sellers, you say short sellers are a problem. When you're not studying short sellers, that is fraudulent misrepresentation.
Look, it's not. The variable that you have in mind, the 20% number you're citing, is a variable that refers to a text search that this guy did to try and find whether or not they actually disclosed a short position. That's what he finds. As he explained in the interview with Frank, it's under-inclusive. It's obviously possible that market participants talk. That's not news to you, Carson. But let's put that all to one side. At the end of the day, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right that most academics draw the conclusion that short activism adds value in the long run. And by the way, it's my intuition that they're right. But I just want to say, given the experience that you've put Josh Mitz through, no one else is ever going to write that short activists might destroy value, or else they're going to end up on the wrong end of a paper on SSRN entitled, "Here's Why You Suck, Love Carson."
God willing. But one thing that we didn't actually get into in our paper, but it was reminded of this when I was watching Josh speak there, and he said that he was interested initially in this idea that pseudonymous short activists would switch identities, and he concluded in his paper that they do. Well, if you turn to the back and you look at the words or the phrases that occur most frequently, like that's what he uses to base his conclusion that they do. So it's the word fraud is not even in there. The word misrepresentation isn't even in there. The most frequently used phrase is equity long short. And you know what that is? That's a tag that Seeking Alpha puts on papers that are on the articles written by people who say when they sign up, like, this is my style, I'm equity long short. So, this thing is just a pile of shit from top to bottom. Like, you've got the fraud, but then you have the incompetence as well when it comes to stuff like that. Saying that these guys are the same authors because they all say equity long short somewhere in the article.
Listen, and this is the point I was trying to make to everybody earlier. And Carson, I say this with great affection and respect for one of the finest, sort of most courageous, thoughtful market participants I know. What you just heard, where someone calls this academic work a pile of shit, is not an academic objective assessment of the quality of the empirical work. It is the passion of somebody who's on the other side of what's apparently a very contentious series of conversations with the federal government about what he did or did not do in connection with the markets. And by the way, I just want to say, I would feel the same way. And I want to say, Carson, with great respect, I think the part of your intervention here that's been less helpful including in this conversation, is the part where you call him names, and he's an incompetent fool. You've got a slide, you've got a picture in the SSRN draft. This is actually hilarious. I gotta say, dare for the grace of God go I that I've never been on the wrong side of Carson Block. I mean, because as an exhibit to his SSRN paper, he's got a picture of Mitz that makes him look like a lunatic, like his eyes are, like he's giving a lecture or something. His eyes are bugging out. He looks like an actual lunatic. And you draw the inference, yeah, Carson's right. This guy must be crazy, like because he looks like it. Here's what I want to say, Carson. That's not super helpful. What I'd be interested in is not your view about whether the guy who wrote the paper that led to a search warrant on your door should get tenure. I'm less interested in your view about that because, with respect, I'm not sure you can be objective. I'm more interested in your view about what is the right role of academics in the marketplace. Because I got to tell you, Carson, do you agree with me? People follow their incentives. You know that better than anybody in the room. Do you think anybody ever will write a paper skeptical of short sellers after what you just put Josh Mitz through? I'll tell you right now, I'd love to share with you my courage for being an academic, but
if they're not manipulating the data, if they're not misrepresenting it, sure, go ahead and write it. I mean, actually, Wuyang Zhao of UT, who's written a lot of
we had a question.
papers.
Please tell me. I'd love to hear the question. Sir, I can tell you have a strong view, but let me just say, just to be super clear about this, what happened here is this guy published a paper that the guy's an academic fraud during the pendency of his tenure case. And I can tell you all the other things that happened with the outreach to the university, et cetera. You tell me, you name me the academic that's going to want to put his name on a paper that's skeptical about the marketplace that takes career risk like that.
I'm sorry, Carson, are you able to hear the rest of this conversation or not? I just want to make sure you're able to hear.
I'm not really.
Are you able to hear what's coming from the audience or not?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry, Carson. I should
repeat, Rob, if you could just repeat, yeah.
The question we got, a colleague, someone in the room said, look, Rob, bullshit, because I looked at the GameStop hearing, and there's plenty of academics who are willing to testify about the potential destructive work of short sellers. And I think that's a very fair and good point. The point I'm just making is that if somebody who puts their work out into the world and offers a data set and says, what do you think, and gets back, you're a fraud and a pile of shit, and I'm going to try to keep you from getting tenure, that's going to keep the next guy from writing the paper. And I just think that's obviously true. You can disagree with me if you like, but I can tell you I'm an academic. I'd love to give you a lecture about academic.
None of that bears on whether he committed fraud or not. I mean, it's good, like diversion and, how wound up am I? But when 20.9% only are short, I mean, what's the response here? I mean, the idea, Josh's response in that video was, they're getting paid by hedge funds. Where's the evidence? And again, when you compare those three groups, you do not see the reversals outside of earnings announcements. So, that none of this actually goes to whether he committed fraud. I could be a certified lunatic, but if I'm right, I'm right. His data shows only 20.9%, and he went and attacked short sellers. In fact, in his paper, he calls everything a short attack. I mean, don't you have to be short to launch a short attack? Again, like maybe maybe my understanding of the English language isn't, what it should be, but it certainly would imply that 1,700
to launch a short attack.
Authors.
You have to be someone who thinks the stock is overpriced. And like, what's hard about this? What about when a journalist writes an article? I understand. At FraudFest, look, I said at the start that Carson is and should be the hero of anybody in this room. If you're serious about putting people to task for fraud, this is your guy. And mine too. I was on the SEC, and I saw the limits of what SEC lawyers can do. So I know how valuable Carson is. All I'm trying to say is keep an open mind about the possibility that someone who's on the wrong end of a search warrant about a paper is not going to give you an objective telling about that paper.
Just download the spreadsheet then. See if my math is off. Look at how many of them are short. That's all you have to do. Download the spreadsheet.
I'm sorry, Jesse has a question. Sorry, Carson. I'll repeat the question.
I'm a great admirer of your tenure at the SEC.
Thanks, Jesse.
Josh Mitz has been helpful to me as a reporter, but I sort of feel like it's greatest minds of my generation destroyed by madness. And you yourself are saying that short sellers provide a salutary force in the market.
Absolutely.
That you have personally experienced.
Yep.
And now the primary argument you're offering today is an incentive structure. Who in academia would ever take the other side of Carson block? But what about the incentive structure of a federal investigation? What about the power of the federal government to chill short selling? A salutary force in the marketplace here. Given that prosecutors have discretion, the fundamental job of regulators and prosecutors is to exercise discretion. What cases to take? Is this the priority that the Department of Justice, with its, I would say, lackluster track record on white-collar crime, should be taking, given the incentives that you just laid out? What about that?
So, Carson, I don't know if you heard Jesse's question, but it's a very important one, so I'm going to repeat it. Can you hear me, Carson?
I did.
Okay.
I
You heard the
actually
question?
heard Jesse. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So Jesse's question is, Rob, is this what the DOJ really ought to be doing? And I'm very open to the possibility that maybe it's not. Jesse, the truth is, I don't know. And we talked together over the years a long time. I'm not going to lie to you. Of course I don't know. My only point, and if your point is by using their resources this way, they take one of the few salutary forces in the market and chill it, because that's what they may have done to Carson, of course you're right. But Jesse, in that case, Carson's beef, and perhaps yours too, is not with the law professor. It's with the Department of Justice and the magistrate who authorized the search warrant. Like, we don't have a Fourth Amendment that says you can be served a search warrant on oath or affirmation or Journal of Legal Studies papers. It's a Fourth Amendment that says you get issued a search warrant if a magistrate concludes there is probable cause, and that's what happened here. Now, whether that's a good thing for the market, Jesse, I don't know, and you sound skeptical, and so I would be too. But that's not a beef that should lead us to publicly pursue a case of academic fraud against an academic when, in fact, we can't sustain those claims. But Carson, please.
You pursue academic fraud where there's academic fraud. Look, maybe I would never have downloaded that data absent the search warrant, but I downloaded the data. The data is what the data is. You say you studied short sellers and they distort the stock, they manipulate the stocks. Well, if you don't study short sellers, then there's a problem. That's a fraudulent misrepresentation. I mean, it's intentional because it's in your own data. I don't think you misinterpreted it. I mean, it's, like that, nothing changes that. So regardless of my motivation for at that point in time, downloading the spreadsheet, that is what it is. It's a fraud.
I'll be very unpopular cutting you off at this point, but why don't you each just take a minute to sum up? Carson, you go first, and then we'll give Rob the last word.
I mean, look, I feel like I've largely said it, but the data that Josh presented as having, been that of short sellers was not that of short sellers. It was basically people writing things like, oh, Chipotle is probably going to miss earnings because there's been inflation. It's a great company, but the growth expectations are so high, I think the stocks can go down. Like, that literally is the bulk of what Josh studied. It's not guys like me who get sued all the time, with Josh sometimes serving as the expert witness. He didn't study activist short selling. Now, in terms of, talk to, the DOJ or whatever, I mean, bottom line, none of that matters. I'm here talking about a paper that I was talking about in 2019. In 2019, the guy would face me. After he published his data, the guy would not face me. That's the paper I'm talking about, or that's what I'm talking about. That paper, that's a fraud. Maybe the rest of his work is amazing. I don't know. I don't have an opinion on it. Josh Mitz committed academic fraud when he wrote Short and Distort.
He didn't, and it's not close. What you're hearing is not a critique of the paper. What you hear Carson saying, just pay attention to what he's saying, guys. What he's saying is this paper doesn't show that Carson, did anything wrong. His beef isn't with the paper. It's with the Department of Justice and the people who pursued a search warrant against him. And I know You can't believe me because Carson's your hero, and I understand. I didn't come to convince you of that. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is, this guy presented it as if it was an objective academic critique, and he's on the wrong end of a search warrant having to do with the paper. If you want to treat that as objective evidence, you're entitled to. I'll just say I'm a guy who, for a living, is skeptical of people who have incentives to tell me one side of the story, and that's what you got today.
The only person who could possibly follow this act is Diana Enriquez, and so you'll be up next. But let's just give a round of applause to both of you. Thank you both so much for being willing to do this, to both of you.
Thanks.